Christopher Parker from the University of Washington. Christopher is a professor of political science.
He's talking about me, you guys. Come on. Get the man on the floor.
At the University of Washington. Parker is the author of 2 award-winning books, Change They Can't Believe In, The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America, and Fighting for Democracy, Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South. He's currently working on another book, The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of American Democracy. Second panel, Dr. Tulia Falletti, Department of Political Science, also Director of PLAS at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the class of 1965 term Associate Professor of Political Science, Director of the Latin American and Latino Studies Program, and Senior Fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the author of Decentralization and Subnational Politics in Latin America, which earned the Donnelly Van Cott Award for the best book on political institutions by the Latin American Studies Association, and with Santiago Cunial of Participation in Social Policy. She's co-editor with Orfeo Fioretos and Adam Scheingate of the Oxford Handbook of Historical Institutionalism, and with Emilio Prado of Latin America since the last term. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Moderated by Giovanni Herschel, the grad student of political science.
Okay, well, I can guarantee you nobody's going to fall asleep on this one. That's just kind of what I do. I just present myself as kind of crazy. I'm really not. But I like to have fun with this stuff. So the title of this talk is, well, first of all, let me thank Mike for inviting me here. Mike has been, I've been a fan of Mike's for a long time. I used to have aspirations of being as smart as him. That's never going to happen, so I'll settle for friendship right now. So what I'm going to talk about here is, like I said, I'm truly a neophyte when it comes to like democracy in the big picture. And so this is like sort of my second foray into this. I just wrote a review for How Democracies Die. It's going to be part of a symposium and perspective on politics. I think it's coming out, I think next month, if I'm not mistaken. And so I started really down that rabbit hole in earnest with that review. And so I'm just trying to follow that up right now with some thoughts of my own as it relates to my own work. So American democracy and difference, the centrality of race, not working class white folk. And let me say why I stress that. I stress that because back when the Tea Party book first came out, my co-author, Matt Barreto, who's now at UCLA, he and I were the first ones to say, he and I were the first ones to call bullshit on economic anxiety, right, when it comes to attraction to these right-wing movements. And I mainly noticed that in the writing of the book, because as I noticed, a lot of people wanted to say the Klan was all about economic anxiety and Billy Joe Jim Bob and Mary Sue, and that's not what the case was, right? And it wasn't the case with the John Birch Society in the 1950s and the 1960s, nor was it the case with the Tea Party, right? And so even now with Trump, people are talking about, oh, it's about economic anxiety and the nervous working class whites. And now other people are saying that that is not the case either, right? And so I just get tired of people trying to make, you know, this division in American politics, or the people that are put out most in American politics, they try to make it about working class whites. I'm not saying that they don't have their own problems, but there are other folk too, you know, who are put out as well, right? I happen to be clearly a black man, so guess where my sympathies lie. So why I'm so interested in this topic? So first of all, let's get a definition of democracy, and I just went to Robert Dahl's work. Because as it turns out, I don't think most people actually know what democracy is. So when you see some of these survey items that ask about how proud of you of democracy in the United States, or if you're taking a world value survey, wherever you are in the world, people give these answers, but I'm not quite sure, I'm not convinced they really understand what it means. So I've taken the liberty of quoting Dahl from On Democracy on page 37. It essentially boils down to political equality. According to Dahl, quote, all members are to be treated under the Constitution as if they were equally qualified to participate in the process of making decisions about the policies the association will pursue. Whatever may be the case in other matters, then, in governing this association, all members are to be considered politically equal, right? So I just kind of use that as my starting point. So this is what made me interested in the study of democracy writ large. My first book dealt with studying a left-wing or progressive social movement, the civil rights movement, and the role that Black veterans played within the civil rights movement. And my second book was about studying a right-wing movement, the Tea Party, and that was change they can't believe in. So the former was about the expansion of democracy, and the latter was about the contraction of democracy. And it just made me realize, just seeing the gulf that separated these two groups. So I'm thinking, like, what is democracy really about? What does it mean? Why is it so important? And so when we got into this new book on Trump, it continued to fascinate me. Like, what is it about democracy that makes it so special, given that, you have so many losers, at least in American democracy, and what Professor Winters was suggesting, we see it in other democracies as well. So here are some of the celebrated works on American democracy, at least of recent vintage. You got Bartels' Unequal Democracy, you got Aiken and Bartels' Democracy for Realists, and then you have Page and Gillen's work, Democracy in America, which clearly is a takeoff on Tocqueville stuff. But the problem is, none of them talk about race in any real sustained, tangible way. So my question is, how can you talk about American democracy without talking about race and have people take it seriously? I don't think you really can, right? And if I knew most of you people better, I'd be using all kind of polysyllabic swear words, because this just gets me worked up. I don't understand it. So the question is, what about race and racism? What about, this is more recent stuff, access to the ballot, right? We know about the assault on the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, with Shelby versus Holder. Also, when we're talking about the voter ID laws that are in many locales that weren't covered under Section 5 of the VRA. And then back in the day, of course, we can talk about slavery and Jim Crow, among other things, right? So we think about the foundation of race and racism on which this country rests. How can you exclude the discussion of race and racism in any discussion of American democracy, or at least any honest discussion of American democracy? So here's a question that I approach this with. Is it really about race, or is it really about class? So what I do from here is I actually just reviewed this book for University of Chicago Press that one of my buddies wrote. And he actually wrote a book comparing race and democracy. So all the slides you see right now of these figures, right, that's actually from his book. It's called Dangerously Divided. I forget the subtitle right now, but hopefully it'll be forthcoming with University of Chicago Press shortly. So let's see if we can see this here. All right. So this is about the independent impact of race, class, and other demographic factors on voting Democratic in the 2012 presidential election. I do not have my pointer. I wish I did. But so if we look at here right to the left, what we're doing is we're looking at the relative probability of blacks voting for Barack Obama, Latinos voting for Barack Obama, and Asians voting for Barack Obama vis-a-vis whites, right? And so we'll see the percentage point difference, right? So blacks were 52 percentage points higher in their support for, or likelihood in support for Barack Obama than were whites. And we can make the same adjustment or accounting for it vis-a-vis these other races, Latinos and Asian Americans. Now look at the class-based stuff. We have education, income, home. Look at this stuff. You see how low it is relative to race, and especially vis-a-vis black folks. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 2016 election. So blacks versus whites, right? So black folks were 50% more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than were whites, right? Latino versus white, we see something similar, and we see the magnitude isn't as great for Asian Americans vis-a-vis whites, but it's still on the positive side, and it's really significant. But once again, look at the class-based stuff here. High school versus college grad. Income, right? Look at this. This pales in comparison vis-a-vis race. Now we're going to look at representation. So we have in the blue bar right here, you have the national representation, national population for each racial group, right? We don't have whites in this image here. And then we see it their levels of representation at various levels of government: local, state, House, Senate. And so when we look at blacks, local office vis-a-vis the national black population, it's kind of low, right? State, it's a little higher. House, higher still, right? But when we get to Senate, look at where the dark or the lighter blue bar is for the Senate. So Latinos are less well represented, and Asian Americans relative to other groups, right? In an absolute sense, they're okay. In a relative sense, not so much, right? So we see even when it comes to representation, right? There are real problems when we look at the national population vis-a-vis the different levels of government. So now let's look at what he calls policy winners and losers. And so how he measures policy winners and losers, so Zoli took about 40 years of data and examined federal spending preferences. And so what he did, and we're talking about across a range of issues, when it comes to welfare, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to a range of issues. And this is what he found, right? So for policy winners, right, when it comes to black folks only won 32% of the time, right? You look at whites are much higher, and Asian Americans are higher still. Blacks and Latinos, blacks by a long shot are much lower than everybody else, right? When we look at class, look at the class variables here. They're much higher, well, they're definitely much higher than when it comes to black folks, right? So what we're gonna see is, towards the end of this talk, we're gonna see an increasing pattern of the ways in which, black folks are really getting the short end of the stick when it comes to democracy, right? I mean, even more so than Latinos and a lot more so than Asian Americans. Okay. So what we're looking at now is a predictive probability. So what we're doing here is controlling for all these other factors and trying to see if there's still an effect that's associated with race, in particular, white versus black. And what this figure right here on the far left, white versus black, what that represents is the probability of a white person being a policy winner vis-a-vis a black person, and that's about 5%. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when we're accounting for all these other factors, demographic, religious, and then we get over here to class, right? Look at the ways in which the white versus black dynamic actually dwarfs the dynamic here when it comes to class. It's not even close. Okay, so now what we're looking at the black-white gap when it comes to policy responsiveness with respect to the differences in policy responses by composition of the executive and legislative branches. So if we look at the far left right here under Republican president, the black-white policy responsiveness difference is 8%. When we get to a straight-up Democrat president, the gap drops down to 4.5%. When we get to a divided Congress, it shoots back up to 8%. When we get to a Democrat Congress, that is to say both chambers are Democrat, it drops to about 2%. And then when we get a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress, it actually swings in the other direction, right? So then black folks become policy winners at this point and not policy losers. So why emphasizing class is dangerous? The normative argument is that assessments of democracy should include all citizens. It shouldn't just be about the white working class. I mean, there are other divisions, there are other losers, that are in American society, right? You got the gender gap, right? You also have the racial gap. You have gaps when it comes to immigrants, right? So this should not always be about class, because when it's about class, guess who it's about? It's about white people. It's about the white working class, right? And so when we think about the white working class, if you look at this in any period in history empirically, guess what? The white working class tend to be the most backward, right? They are the most racist and the most sexist. So once again, my sympathies lie more with people of color in this regard. Because at the very end of the day, the white working class, guess what they have working in their advantage, if nothing else? they're white. Yeah, and we just saw the empirical evidence, right? The empirical / positive argument. Class pales in comparison to race. And this is just a smattering of the findings that Zoli found in his book. I couldn't put everything up here because I wanted to leave some time to actually discuss this, right? But, through chapter after chapter, the race versus class comparison, it's not even close. Why does democracy disadvantage black folks so much? So we have one argument, which I think is consistent with Mike's argument. You had the black exceptionalism argument that was made by David Sears and a junior colleague back in 2006 that was published in Political Psych. They call it black exceptionalism. So what they did was they looked at a number of areas, that were sort of bases of comparison, right? And they also looked at, Latinos, Asian Americans, and black folks and whites. And what they found is that consistently, black folks fared much worse than Latinos and Asian Americans, right? And that's why they call this black exceptionalism. And it has to do with a seemingly impermeable color line, right? I mean, so with Asian Americans, you have the model minority thing. With Latinos, you have a bunch of them that can pass, right? But with us, it's hard for us to pass, right? So that's what they attribute to this black exceptionalism, because we have this indelible marker of our skin color. And what Mike's book shows, brilliantly, right? When I first read it, can I reveal that I was a reviewer? Oh, I guess I did, huh? I mean, it just blew me away. I mean, just think about the ways in which we're taught and conditioned to think about democracy, right? And what Mike brought to the table, and it made a whole lot of sense to me after I really gave it some sustained thought. In order for democracy to actually work, you have to have some people that are exploited, right? And in the American context, it tends to be people of color. So Mike and I were talking about this last night. What are some alternatives? Social democracy, right? All these Bernie bro people are like, hey, this should work. Let's make this all about class, right? And how this happened in Seattle. Bernie Sanders came out there a couple years ago, and he tried to give a talk. He was interrupted by some Black Lives Matter activists, because Bernie was trying to make everything about class, right? But you can't reduce race or subordinate race to class. You can't do it. It's not going to work with people of color for the most part. Yeah, there are going to be some people who think it does. It does not, right? When we think about people of color, people don't see our class when we walk into a car dealership or a furniture store. They see this. And we are discriminated on the basis of our skin color. So even though I might do well or Mike does well, Mike's bigger than me, right? So they're really scared of him, right? They make up. Come on. Co-sign. Mike, you got co-sign for me on this later. There are all kinds of stereotypes. I know you're the convener of this conference, but come on. But yeah, they make all kinds of stereotypes about us. They don't see us as having PhDs or adhering for the most part to middle class, value. They just see black men, right? And we get treated accordingly. I got all kinds of stories where, went on vacation in Hawaii one time, the most remote island. Was it Hawaii? It was Lanai, right? And I'm sitting by the pool for 3 hours, and nobody came and took my order. They took everybody else's order but mine, right? And the one thing that I have that they didn't have, my skin, right? Even though we were staying at this hotel. Now, here's the tricky part about it. When I went to go complain to the maitre d' had the temerity, the unmitigated gall, the balls to ask me, are you staying at this hotel? Where the fuck else am I going to be staying? Right? So I'm just, and all of us have these kind of stories if we're honest with ourselves, right? So it's not about class for us. It's about race for us. So that's one thing. Yes, race does largely determine our respective class position. Yes, it does. And it should work in theory, but it does not, right? And working class whites generally tend to be the most racist. So that's one thing, because they're the less secure. So working class whites are the most racist. It won't appeal to people of color for the reasons I just mentioned. It requires homogeneity to work, right? So if we think about the societies in which social democracies are the most successful, they're mainly homogenous societies, right? We think about Scandinavia for one place, right? If we think about like other places in which you have this huge gap between people of color, huge gap in inequality, especially when it comes to people of color, you know, look at the more diverse societies. Look at the United States for one, and look at Great Britain for another one, right? When we look at where they rank in terms of equality among OECD countries, we don't fare that well. Then the next question about social democracy is how it's implemented. That's fantasy land. And if we look at it historically, you had the Populist Party or the People's Party of the mid to late 19th century. That didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because a Democrat white man came in there and played the race card. Done, right? When we start talking about the New Deal, black folks, especially when it came to Social Security, were essentially written out of the New Deal. You know why? Because you had these Southern Democrats who had seniority in Congress, didn't want us included. There were two classes of workers that were excluded from Social Security: agricultural workers and domestics. And guess where we were mainly working? Agriculture and domestic service. Ooh, I guess that's it. Thank you. You scared me with the whole 5-minute thing. I actually had a little more to say to rip off of, but I'll sit down.
Okay, so you'll alert me. You'll let me know. 5 is great. Thank you. Well, hi everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for Michael Hansher for inviting me to be part of this very exciting conference. What I want to do today with you is to share some of my work in progress, which asks a question that is related to the questions for today, and is related to the issue of antinomies of democracy, which is why or how do democratic institutions become strong? Why do some remain very weak while others strengthen? So what I'm going to do is to make you travel south of the hemisphere to South America. And within South America, we're going to focus mostly on Bolivia. So first, let me start with the motivation for this work. Those of us who study Latin America, who are from Latin America, are still very much in shock about the results of the presidential elections in Brazil these past months, and the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president-elect of Brazil. However, it is also true that during at least the last 2 decades, Latin America as a region has been a laboratory of democratic innovations that have been exported to the rest of the world. These democratic innovations have been defined by Graham Smith as institutions specifically designed to increase and deepen citizen participation in the political decision-making process. Many of these institutions were in fact explicitly designed to increase popular participation. This is to say, participation by citizens in the lower socioeconomic strata in society. These institutions were thus explicitly designed to augment the voice of underprivileged citizens, thus politically helping to address some of the inequities stemming from the socio-economic structure, one of the antinomies of democracy. One example of democratic or participatory institution, as many of you know, is participatory budgeting. As a new institution, it originated in Brazil, the same country that has given us Jair Bolsonaro recently, in Brazil municipalities in the 1970s, and it gained world notoriety when it became very when it was implemented in Porto Alegre in the late 1980s by the Workers' Party. From there, it is spread throughout the world. The map that you see in the slide is a map of the year 2010, where it represents the number of governments at all levels, city, state, or national, that have adopted participatory budgeting. As you can see, it had spread around the world, but still 63% of the experiences with participatory budgeting were in Latin America. And I said that this was an institution explicitly designed to help the poor. These are some of the projects that went on in Porto Alegre in the early 2000s, shared by a colleague there, Adelmer Marchetti, which present on the top what the slums looked like before participatory budgeting and what they looked after the community had decided how to invest part of the city budget in housing projects. Here is another of those projects in Porto Alegre. So today I'm going to talk to you about participatory institutions, a different type of participatory institution. But before I move on to describing the type of participatory institution I want to discuss with you, let me make it explicit that when I'm thinking of participatory institutions, I'm thinking of formal institutions that are sanctioned by the state, that seek to channel community participation in civil society, often at the local level, and as I mentioned before, are explicitly created to augment citizen participation in public policy making. This means that these institutions often deal with distributive decisions about public goods or social services. I mentioned participatory budgeting, but in Latin America, we've also seen water committees, oversight committees, local health councils, and prior consultation, which is the institution about which I will be talking today. How many of you, a show of hands, have heard of prior consultation or know what prior consultation is? If anyone can raise your hands. 1, my former research assistant. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, but this is still a fairly unknown institution to most of us. Prior consultation is the collective right of indigenous communities to be consulted prior to the realization of extractive or mega infrastructure projects that could affect their environment. It stems from an ILO convention, International Labour Organization convention from 1989 on the rights of tribal peoples. And to date, 22 countries around the world, I think, yeah, here's the map. 22 countries around the world have ratified that convention that gives indigenous communities the right to be consulted before mega infrastructure projects affect their territory and environment. And 15 of those 22 countries are in Latin America. As you can see in this map, pretty much all countries in Latin America have signed have ratified this convention, which makes it quite salient. So what I'm going to argue today is that for this institution to acquire a strength, to be more than a simple window dressing institution or a parchment institution, what we need is the incorporation in the process of regulation and implementation of the institutions, of the sectors that were mobilized for its adoption. So what I will call political incorporation. And in this case, of indigenous groups or indigenous movements. Before I get into the definition of indigenous political incorporation, let me stress that when I'm thinking of institutional strength, I'm thinking of the societal aspects of it, which is compliance, and the state aspect of it, which is enforcement. An institution will be strong when on the compliance side, on the societal side, we have both legitimacy, people believe that this institution is rightful or fair, and it can be used to resolve conflicts, and it's also efficacious. This is to say, people obey the institution because they see it as a shorthand or a shortcut to get to collective decisions that is more efficient than alternative arrangements. We also need enforcement, and in this case, because these are institutions that are state-sanctioned, who needs to enforce the institution is the state. So the state should penalize non-compliance. With regards to indigenous political incorporation, I adapt the work of political scientists who looked at labor political incorporation, and I'm thinking of sustained and at least partially successful attempts by the state to legitimate and shape an indigenous movement, an institutionalized indigenous movement. Okay. So in the paper, I go over different theoretical scenarios that take us from the moment of institutional creation to strong institutions. On the compliance side, I ask by asking, do the mobilized social actors who seek to change behavior or distribution of power with the adopted institution have this goal? Do the mobilized actors, sorry, that was a question, seek to change behavior or distribution of power with this institution? If the answer to that is no, then we'll see a weak institution in the form of aspirational right. Sometimes there are legal communities, for example, who seek to introduce a law or a norm, a legal norm, that it's only in the books as an aspirational right because they know that this cannot be either complied with or enforced. So in that regard, it serves as a compass for future action, but not something that can be achieved now. If the mobilized actors do want to change behavior with this institution, then the key question to me to figure out whether or not this institution will gain a strength is whether they are politically incorporated. If the answer is no, then what we'll have is a sequence of reactive events between government and mobilized actors. Mobilized social movements will keep on demanding incorporation, which will be denied, and there will be this confrontational sequence of events between a state and society. If the answer is yes, that the mobilized social actors are politically incorporated, then I think we'll have the basis for a strong institution on the compliance side as long as the institution remains legitimate and is seen as an efficacious institution by society. On the other side, sort of the flip coin side of institutional strength is the state. And what does the state do? Enforcement. So here the first question is, does the state seek to change behavior or the distribution of power with this institution? Again, if the answer is no, it has no intention of enforcing the institution, this will be a mere window dressing institution. If the answer is yes, the state would like to change behavior with this institution, then we need to ask, is the institution enforceable? It could be that, yes, the state wants to change behavior, but that the institution cannot be enforced because perhaps there are informal norms in society that are too strong for this institution to be enforced or for whatever other reasons. If it is enforceable, then does the state have the will to enforce the institution? We knew that it wanted to change behavior, but then the state, as an state apparatus, does it have the will? Alicia Holland has written a book about how the state sometimes does not have the will to enforce the law, and she calls those situations of forbearance. if the state does have the will, then does it have the capacity? Does it have the resources and a state capacity to enforce the institution? And that's what will distinguish whether it is a strong institution, if it has all those elements, or not a weak institution if it doesn't. In previous work with a former graduate student, now an assistant professor at Providence College, Thea Riofrancos, what we laid out was a series of variables or a trajectory by which institutions could become strong. I mentioned before that we start by saying that participatory institutions need mobilize social actors to come to the fore and to become strengthened. And this stems from a large review of the secondary literature where we found that participatory institutions that were imposed from above very rarely got to be durable or strong. Instead, the institutions that became entrenched in civil society were those that were generated by mobilized social actors, first and foremost. That leads to the adoption of the institution, but then the key question is, are these mobilized actors incorporated into the state or not? And what we found was that when they were not incorporated, the institution remained weak, and in our collaborative work, that was the case of prior consultation in Ecuador, whereas when the mobilized actors became part of the state or became to be represented in the political party system and have a voice in the process of regulation and implementation, then the institution is strengthened. So what I want to do is to, in the time that I have remaining, describe how this happened in Bolivia. Perhaps a little bit of a positive, note or a little quote of a little doses of optimism about what mobilized civil society can do. So the process of institutionalizing prior consultation, this collective indigenous right in Bolivia, started with the big mobilization, a national level mobilization of indigenous groups from the eastern part of the country. I should have a map here of Bolivia, sorry, which is the area of the Amazon that had been traditionally excluded from the corporatist pact that had been in place since the mid-20th century. So this indigenous group marched to the capital city of Bolivia, La Paz, in what was known as the March for Territory and Dignity. This march puts the indigenous issue, which is interesting. These are native-born. These are supposed to be citizens, but nonetheless excluded from the polity until then. And it puts their issue in the national agenda. A year later, the government of Bolivia ratifies the ILO 169, largely as a response to this mobilization. And I have a photo here of what this mobilization looked like. That process of reactive events between government and social movement continues all the way up to 2005 with events that became very, very well known in the region, which were the water wars of 2000, the gas wars of 2003. Throughout that time, the indigenous movement gains organizational capacity and demands the implementation of prior consultation, such that by the time that a new hydrocarbons law is negotiated in 2005, there is a long title in the law dedicated to how prior consultation is going to take place whenever gas is going to be extracted. And remember, gas is the principal export of Bolivia, so this is a very important industry for the country. From 2005 to 2009, the state now occupied by MAS, the Movimiento al Socialismo Party, the party of Evo Morales, enforces the law, and prior consultation is implemented from 2006 to 2017 in 56 communities, where the communities negotiate with the corporations and with the state the conditions under which extraction of gas is going to take place, and it negotiates the different type of payments that the company will have to give the community in compensation for use of their territory and for the spoils that they could cause in their environment. From 2009 to the present, the institution remains strong, but there is a more contentious relationship between the government and the indigenous movement, which since then has been divided between those who support the government of Evo Morales and those who are against it. But what I want to argue is that throughout this movement, because the indigenous groups were incorporated in the MAS state, in the state led by Evo Morales, they were incorporated in the process of regulating and implementing the institution. The institution gained legitimacy, efficacy as it was implemented in civil society, and it was enforced by the state. Even after there was a significant drop in the international price of gas, that meant that the government of Evo Morales was more pressed to extract more. Even under those conditions, when the national government clearly didn't want to apply prior consultation, they still applied it because the institution had become very legitimate in the eyes of the indigenous groups, and they couldn't take it away. These are photos from the archives that show the importance of the organized indigenous movement in the process of regulating prior consultation. They have also been very active in trying to pass a national law of prior consultation that will be independent from the hydrocarbons law that rules on prior consultation in this sector. This map shows some of the communities in which prior consultation has taken place. As you can see, is to the east of the country in what is considered to be the extractive frontier, and the north of La Paz, which is also where there are large gas deposits. As I mentioned before, this happened against the background of an state that is increasingly dependent on the extraction of gas royalties in its state revenues. These are some photos of some of the prior consultations taking place. At times, these are contested processes. But to conclude then, prior consultation was adopted due to high levels of indigenous mobilization. As I mentioned before, based on the secondary literature, we knew that this was a necessary condition for institutional strengthening, but not sufficient. And what in our collaborative work with Theorio Francos and in this article, I'm seeking to show is that the political incorporation of, in this case, the indigenous movement, which was the mobilized movement that brought the institution about, was necessary for prior consultation to gain legitimacy, efficacy among the indigenous communities and organizations, and also for the state to enforce it. Thank you. Thank you.
Definitely have a couple questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Giovanni Rocha. I'm from Brazil, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at Penn at the Department of Political Science. I want to thank Professor Henchard for the invitation to be here, and I also want to thank Professor Falletti and Professor Parker for the presentations today. So I want to take this opportunity to ask questions to you, and I have 3 questions. One that I want to ask both of you, and one that I will ask individually to each of you. So I think we can begin with these questions, and then we open up for questions from the audience. So in this very long journey of 3 months as a PhD student, one question that has resonated with me touches specifically on the idea of political equality. Professor Henchard's most recent book, The Spectre of Race, brings a very enlightening account of facts that debunk or expand the idea of current democracies as arenas that provide political equality. Similarly, as we could see in Professor Parker's presentation, there are plenty of ways to look at the US democracy and see when it fails to achieve this idea of proper political equality, especially when we look at it from the lenses of race. So it seems to be easier to spot the instances where political equality does not exist rather than when it actually occurs. Also from Professor Falletti's presentation, the process of indigenous political incorporation and articulation of indigenous movements to the party system in Bolivia were pivotal to institutional strengthening, and consequently probably moved the country closer to this world where political equality might exist. So my first question to both of you is, in practical terms, what does political equality mean? Is it only universal suffrage, or does it necessarily entail descriptive and substantive forms of representation? And also, as a result of that definition, how closer or further away from it have we gone in the past decade? So that's my question to both of you. Now, for Professor Falletti specifically, as I was reading your paper, it was very interesting to see that you consider a key source of institutional strength this alignment between the interests of the mobilized social actors and the institution's goals and distributional effects. So specifically, as for the mobilized social actors, I think there are specificities to the Bolivian case, right? So when we consider, for example, the recognition of indigenous justice combined with the process of politicization of indigenous identity in the country, and also the fact that indigenous people make up for 40% of the Bolivian population. So in a country like Brazil, indigenous peoples compose less than 1% of the population. In 2018 elections this year in Brazil, it was the first time since 1982 that we elected an indigenous federal deputy, Congresswoman Joênia Wapichana. So there's clearly a difference between the level of incorporation of indigenous people in Brazil. With the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president of Brazil, many people argue that democracy might be at risk. The rights of indigenous populations in Brazil might also be at risk, since Jair Bolsonaro has already said, quote, not 1 centimeter of land would be demarcated for indigenous, end quote. So can we think about the mobilization of other social actors besides those directly benefited from these institutions as a way to revert the scenario? I mean, what is the importance of mobilizing other social actors of civil society in the process of strengthening the institution? So not only those who are benefited by the institution, but also other social actors that might support the same cause. And finally, to Professor Parker.
Well, hold up. Just ask me my question after she finishes answering this one.
Okay, so do you think it's better?
I'm going to forget.
Okay. So maybe I could open the space for you to answer these questions, and then I'll ask you your questions.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Later.
Thank you. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Giovanni. Thank you. Okay. I'll start with the second question, which is easier. I think you're right that the Bolivian case has certain specificities that make the mobilization and incorporation of indigenous movements, quote unquote, easier, since they are such a large share of the population, 40% according to the last census by
but 60% according to the census of 2001. So they did become an important electoral force. Now, the question is, why not earlier, right? They've always been there. And in Bolivia, there was a founding social revolution that sort of laid out, I guess we could say, the first experiments with democracy in 1952. Why only part of indigenous groups were incorporated after that social revolution, which was the indigenous movements of the mountainous area of the west of the country, whereas the eastern indigenous groups remained excluded. So here we have the case, a very, very large native population that do not become political subjects until basically the 1990s, when there is a biometric register that registers many of these people to vote. Until then, they were not even part of the polity; they were completely excluded. So there are specificities. However, what I would argue from a comparative perspective, and now I'm starting a project that looks at articulation of indigenous demands in Argentina and Chile as well, is that electoral incorporation is one type of incorporation. Obviously, it's very important, and it renders the movement successful if they can mobilize electorally. Not always they can do this. As I just mentioned, it took a while for Bolivia to be able to do this, since they were captured by the traditional parties until then. But what I'm looking at is that other demands and other means of incorporation that perhaps are not electoral. The most obvious one is education. There are countries that make accommodations for intercultural education or bilingual education. That's one way of incorporating one of the indigenous demands that have to do with interculturality. There is also the issue that you mentioned of plural legal systems, which not only exist in Bolivia. There's also plural legal system, for example, in some states of Mexico. There is recognition of self-government in other states of Mexico. So there are ways in which incorporation can take place through demands of intercultural education, self-government or autonomy rule, plural legal systems, and in the case of Bolivia, also plurinationality. Although in that regard, Bolivia is the most advanced case I know. So there are other ways in which incorporation can take place, which leads to perhaps different configuration of social movements. With regards to mobilization of other social actors, this brings up the issue of political solidarity, right? To what extent other actors who are not identified racially or ethnically with the movement can become part of the movement. And this, ties with the presentation by Christopher to a certain extent, to what extent you can have solidarity across races for, a Black cause or across ethnicities for an indigenous cause. I think that is very, very hard in societies that have such a minuscule percentage of the population that is indigenous, or even 12 or 15% of the population being Black. I think that level of solidarity is very hard to achieve. You may have it, in very very small sectors of the population. But this, I think there is an important political question, which is to what extent we can, support political projects that respect or that defend the rights of minorities, regardless of how broad that movement is. And I think that is possible. And I think to a certain extent, the progressive states during the time that we had them in Latin America did seek to do that. And part of the project of building participatory institutions had to do with that broader alliance. So it wasn't only about prior consultation, perhaps, but there were the organizaciones territoriales de base, the committees that were working at the local level. So there were many ways of building coalitions to advance more equalitarian causes. Okay, stop there.
Okay. What did you want to answer his first question?
Well, the first question is really hard. So what do we mean by political equality? In practical terms, you ask us, what does political equality mean? Obviously, one answer to that is one person, one vote, which, we always thought this was where we started procedurally with democracy. When you started DOL, how do we start with the procedural definition of democracy? Well, free and fair elections. And what are fair elections? One person, one vote. As we know nowadays, even that seems to be radical. So, with suppression of voting rights, the notion of one person, one vote is being undermined. And remember, this is where we started. This was sort of the minimum possible definition of democracy, procedural democracy. From there, we went to substantive democracy, radical democracy, participatory democracy. So, we had more hopes. And even one person, one vote seems to be, under discussion. So one procedural answer to the issue of political equality is, in effect, to say one person, one vote. I think as Jeffrey Winters has shown in his work, in capitalist, corporatist societies, this masks inequalities that make the one person, one vote sometimes irrelevant. I'm a big defender of universal suffrage and mandatory suffrage. So, I think that we should all have the obligation to vote. If we have an obligation to have a driver's license when we drive, why don't we have an obligation to vote to elect our representatives? But where this is not the case, one person, one vote doesn't mean anything, because those who go to vote are the ones who have more resources, more time, not everybody. So the issue of political equality is highly contextual. I just leave it there.
That's pretty good. So did you want to ask a second question?
Sure. Right. So as we could see, I'll ask from here.
Sure, that's fine.
So as we could see in the results of the last U.S. election, a record of women won offices. A lot of firsts too. So we had Ayanna Pressley became the first African American woman to represent Massachusetts. Sharice Davids, who said is a lesbian, right, openly, and will be the first Native American woman elected to Congress. We have also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who will be the youngest in Congress. Stacey Abrams in Georgia also. So as we think about political equality in the past few years, we necessarily have shifted to an intersectional approach, right? So intersectionality sort of broadens our way to see democratic rights and what it means to be represented. So my question is, if we consider not only race itself, but its intersection with other dimensions of existence like gender, sexuality, origin, age, how do you think this change in the 2018 elections affect the U.S. democracy and possibly like the future presidential elections in 2020?
Well, those are really good questions. You sure you're a first-year student?
Yeah.
Those are good questions, man. So I'll take like my colleague, I'll take the second question first. The second question that you originally asked about political equality. So it encompasses far more than just suffrage. Because with suffrage, suffrage is the key, rather, right? Because it leads to everything else, right? Because it leads to equal political representation. And suffrage, or having a vote, is a principal way, not the, but a principal way in which citizens can hold the representatives accountable, right? So that's really, really important. And then that bleeds over into policy representation, right? So suffrage is key. It's not the only thing, right? Because before we had, as Black people had widespread access to the ballot, we had to seek other means or other channels, right, through which to express our preferences, right, through social movements, right? And as my colleague Dan Gillian here has shown that the social movements, they give signals to representatives and politicians to let them know how deeply felt these sentiments are among a given population, right? But now that we do have the access to the ballot, and one of the things I do want to make clear is that people want to say America is one of the oldest democracies, oldest continuous democracies in the world. I can't even tell you how many ways that's a bunch of bullshit, right? But just here's one, right? If we consider free and fair elections, as one of the signs of a democracy, then when did we really start having free and fair elections? One can say in 1965 with the ratification of the Voting Rights Act. But we see now with these voter ID laws and the damage done to Section 5 of the VRA, I mean, can we really say we have free and fair elections? I don't think so, right? So I want to disabuse anybody that wants to say that America is one of the oldest continuing democracies. That's just not true. So let me just say that. Beyond that, what I do want to say is like having the vote or suffrage, universal suffrage, is the key, and I do believe that compulsory voting should be part of it, right? It's maybe not politically tenable here, but the research shows that there's an inverse relationship between inequality and compulsory voting, right? So you get to these, and it has to be a very specific type of compulsory voting where there's at least a minimal or sort of I'm looking for, a minimal penalty, right? Or there's another word for which I'm searching right now that doesn't occur to me right now. But as long as there's some kind of penalty that's associated with it, then that's going to drive turnout up. And when turnout goes up, then you have a decrease in inequality, right? So I definitely believe that the one person, one vote thing, it does not work, especially in when it comes to capitalism, right? Because you have these oligarchs, that can accumulate so much power, right? We think about Citizens United as one example, right? So this is not a place in which one person, one vote really matters when you have this accumulation of power that is associated with capitalism, right? So that's one thing. So to back up to your question about intersectionality and American politics, and yeah, I do believe that that's because when we think about it, so one of the things that I'm doing right now, some experimental stuff, is showing that this sense of existential threat that I refuse. I've never called this guy my president not one time. I'm not going to start now. The number 45 in his America represents an existential threat to people of color, to women, to immigrants, right? To people who have alternative lifestyles. And so what happens is what we know is from the literature on emotions in politics, and especially emotional appraisal, that literature, it suggests that when it comes to threat really mobilizes people. Negative affect really mobilizes people. And unlike any other time in recent history, what we see now is that we have a guy who wants to take us backwards in time. So if we think about the Tea Party, we think about Trump, we have these temporal references, right? Tea Party, take our country back. Well, in time or from whom, it really doesn't matter. They're functionally equivalent. The second, make America great again. Well, what's so wrong with America right now outside of having the orange man the president, right? So America's becoming more diverse. America's becoming more democratic, or it was until recently, right? We had even before we had the current slate of women who have been so successful in running for office, you had the increasing visibility of powerful women, right? You had the increasing acceptance of same-sex rights, right? So what's so wrong? What was so wrong with America as far as the right wing is concerned is becoming more diverse, right? And it was becoming more accepted, more culturally plural, right? And that was a problem for these people. So I will say that the fact that we see right now that so many women are doing really well, in running for electoral office, and you brought up intersectionality, I think that the more intersectional, these things are, if you're threatened as a woman and as a person of color, right, that increases, the threat to you by 100%, right? And so therefore, yeah, it makes sense that they're going to run for and win office. You know why? Because you have other women and other minorities that are actually feeling empowered and voting for them, right? right? So I don't want us to discount the extent to which threat really matters, right? Negative affect really matters. How do we think conservatives and, Republicans have so often in recent memory punched, quote unquote, above their weight class because they are motivated by this sense of threat, right? And it's always associated with negative affect, mainly anxiety and anger. Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Several states, Texas, California, a number of others. So and as we know, the identity among historically dominant people in the United States has always been this notion of melting pot is basically a pile of food. It's always been in the minds of white people plus plus. Basically what it's been, even among the most liberal, even among the most progressive. So the question is this: as we're going through this demographic transformation, which is unstoppable, we've never seen in the last several centuries an example of either a European, or to use the nicest word one can, European transplant community ever go from being majority to minority. Can that transformation happen without fascism?
Ooh, without fascism. Do you mean fascism in a strict sense, or do you mean some sort of anti or illiberal democracy?
I mean a fascist regime of the sort we are seeing indications of.
You know what? Ultimately, thank you, Professor Winter. Ultimately, I hate to fall back on the whole social science thing. Ultimately, that's an empirical question. Ultimately, but let's say if we were going to make some prescriptions, that's going to be really difficult. Because if you look at this, is going to be a majority-minority country in 2044. At least that's what the demographers say. And as we've seen in the social psych literature, that white folks who are really concerned about the changing demography, they were far more likely to vote for Trump than white folks for whom this wasn't the case. So I would say that, and here's the thing, once again, the idea that, people say, okay, the demography is changing, and so this country's going to be more, it's going to be more pluralist, more tolerant. People were predicting this back in the 1980s with this Firebaugh and Davis piece about cohort replacement, right? That the younger and more progressive cohorts are going to replace the older and more racist cohorts. Well, we see that didn't work out, right? So I would say that, the contention is just going to continue. As the threat to the coming white minority continues to increase just by virtue of demographic change, things are probably going to get worse, right? So to answer your question, I think the probability is higher in going in that direction, unless more progressive whites and people of color, feminists, get out and actually this wasn't the. So Democrats actually did fairly well, outside of the Senate this time around. If that continues, then there's a chance that this trend towards illiberal democracy, or as you guys call it fascism. I'm not convinced that it's going to be fascism necessarily, but that has a chance to stem that tide. But people have to continue to be active and involved and informed and mobilized, and I'm just not so confident in that right now.
To sort of tie the two topics together, and I don't know if you know much about participatory budgeting in the United States, but I'm wondering if an institution like participatory budgeting institution, it is in some parts of the United States, I just know from looking at the participatory budgeting project online, but we don't have it in Philadelphia as far as I know. But I was wondering if that type of institution from Dr. Falletti's talk and from what you're talking, Dr. Parker, do you think might help bring more policy wins among blacks and minorities? And could that be institutionalized in a way that maybe brings more equality in the United States? And either of you could answer that.
I'm going to defer to you because I know nothing about, like Sergeant Schultz said back in Hogan's Heroes, I know nothing. I know I'm dating myself. Okay.
I know it was discussed in Philadelphia a number of years ago, and it was decided not to adopt it. I don't know where it's implemented in the U.S. This is according to this map that I showed you. There is a very small number of cases in the U.S. When thinking about participatory democracy in the context of the U.S., the one institution that tends to be, a primary example is town hall meetings. So those seem to be one type of institution where there is direct participation. Of course, is very much entangled with the electoral process, much more so than any of the other participatory institutions I was talking about, which are disentangled from the electoral process. When I was looking at public health, for example, there were some attempts to include common citizens in the clinics created by the Lyndon Johnson administration as part of the anti-poverty programs, but those faded away after a few decades. So there is, to my knowledge, which is not very extensive, of the U.S. case, there are not strong or not existing participatory institutions other than the town hall meetings.
Yeah, that sounds about
Thank you. This is a question for Professor Parker. So regarding the idea of social democracy, I was curious whether you think a black person would be better off living in the U.S. today or in any of the Scandinavian social democracies.
Scandinavia, without a doubt. That's an easy answer. And seriously, it's just a really easy answer, right? You look at the history of capitalism, what capitalism has given us, right? Okay, let's start out with slavery, right? And then we can go to imperialism, right? So, yeah, I have no doubt that living in a social democracy in any one of the Scandinavian countries or any other social democracy that's even remotely similar would be much better off and much more advantageous. So, I have no doubts about that.
A question for Professor Falletti. I was interested in hearing more what incorporation of mobilized social actors meant for you. I'm aware of a slight amount of literature on black social movements in South America that frames the dangers of incorporation as neutralization of maybe more radical plans. In your account, incorporation is actually necessary for the strong institutional outcomes that you would want to see. How do you understand, is there this danger of neutralization? And how do you sort of understand this balance between incorporation versus neutralization?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yes, I think there is the danger of neutralization. And I do think it's part of the process of normalized politics that you would see less confrontational and protest, go with that. So yeah, I think the demands may become even less radical, but the way in which I think I see incorporation happening is through basically two channels. One is via the state, so the state either co-opts or incorporates these actors into the state apparatus, or via the political party system. So these actors remain oppositional to the government, but nonetheless have enough voice in the representational system such that they can push forward their demands and make them, transpire into regulations and implementations. So yes, it is a process of institutionalizing protest, if you wish, or institutionalizing mobilization such that it becomes part of a normal politics. I am aware of that. And it goes, from like it covers the whole spectrum from having a fully, perhaps, I mean, not fully, but partially autonomous movement that can continue to define itself as autonomous from the state, to a fully co-opted movement that becomes so entangled with the state that you can no longer distinguish. So corporatism was part of that structure for labor, and certainly we can think about that in the way in which other organized groups are incorporated.
So my question is for Professor Parker. I missed the first question, I think, that you asked in the context. I hope I'm not saying something that was already mentioned, but I was wondering what the site of your critique was. In other words, sometimes in the beginning I heard you saying you were actually resisting criticism of the discipline of political science. The study of American politics has yet to incorporate race sufficiently, or the important insights of intersectional theory. And then other points, it sounded like you were also criticizing public discourse. And maybe it's both of those things, because it's the ways in which the study of American politics and political science reproduces what is really a kind of either a found myth or a hegemonic claim that classes really matters. So I just wanted to hear what you
Was that a yes or a no? Wait a minute.
No, I don't think it is. I think we have individuals. I mean, in hegemonic political science, I think we have individuals. That's why behavioralism is, full back in full flesh and in strength. We don't have class in dominant political science.
Yeah, so then a follow-up would be, is the move on the part of progressive political scientists who study American politics to bring class in, but displace race? So I'm just asking, do you think who you're really criticizing when you say, I can't believe that people talk about American politics without talking about race?
Oh, I'm criticizing political scientists. I mean, so here's what happens. So we tend to get really marginalized often. I mean, women do too. Gender, it's the same thing, right? But I think it's more egregious, but not more egregious, but I think it's more prevalent when it comes to race. I think that what happens is when it comes to the whole class thing, so this is beyond the fact that it's just not correct empirically, but normatively I have a big problem with the emphasis on working class whites, because when it comes to, support for Trump and support for the Tea Party, even going back to the Klan stuff, right? It was always about economic anxiety, but what that does is it displaces the centrality of race, right? It completely erases this and leads it. And to me, if we're going to really move to that more perfect union, you have to have a discussion around that. Now, I don't know why more mainstream political scientists don't want to have a conversation about race. I don't know if this illusion is attached to this idea that it's not important, or maybe perhaps they don't feel comfortable in discussing it, right? But it is a huge problem. If it's not part of the discourse, right, then how do we solve this problem, right? And so it's primarily a critique of mainstream political scientists, right, who claim to be experts on democracy, but somehow race is almost always missing from the analysis.
Yes, so, if we ask what does democracy really amount to, we have episodes and failure, and then powerful people lobby, less powerful people agitate, and so in between the episodes of voting, that's sort of what it amounts to. But following on your point about participatory budgeting, I was wondering, what about the idea that every year, American Idol means that we have the technology to be able to choose a national singer, right? We seem to be able to do that, however we vote. But we have the opportunity, for example, there are 21 categories of the federal government's budget. What if every citizen had 21 units that on an annual basis they could allocate to signal, defense versus education versus transportation versus, in other words, an opportunity to participate in a macro way, not micro decisions about how you spend it, 5-year moving average so that you don't have sudden jolts of change in the budgeting, but a way to signal, I don't like the fact that we're at war for 16 years. I'm going to give 21 of my units to education. And others in the society will also do this. And these signals from the population are binding on our legislatures in terms of expenditures. It's a way to have ongoing signal. So not the local, thus far the whole participatory budgeting thing is a local story. Park versus filling potholes. But can't we do this? Can't we participate in our democracy in an ongoing way that is at a macro level? City, state, federal. Why can't we do it? Would you support it?
That's for you. Yeah.
Yes, of course, I would support it. And participatory budgeting has been tried to be scaled up, and it has been adopted at the regional level in some European countries. At the national level, I don't know of any cases. But certainly it could be scaled up. And I think, what you are proposing sounds like wonderful. I mean, it would be so nice. I think I want to think that our defense budget would be much lower and our education budget would be much higher. I'd like to think that that's the way it will work. I think that the way we are operating now, we do have some sort of these thermometer measures, which are, public opinion polling. And here we go back to the issue of what does the media do, what is social media doing, and the big question at the end of the day was if it was politically feasible to move to this arrangement where we allocate portions of the budget, in a universal way, then what the result would be. And I have to say, nowadays I'm not sure. I'm not sure that this would result in anything better than what we have. I think our civil society is becoming very illiberal or very uncivil in many ways. So this is to think if politically we could get there. Of course, the prior question is how do we get there? And that's a political project which I don't know how to move forward in this country.
A little bit of this time, ask me the last question, two for Chris, and then for Tulia. For Professor Parker, two questions. How would internal variation in the Black in the United States complicate this? But I mean, after Latino, Caribbean, African, all the demographic shifts that occurred in the past, say, 20 years, will they complicate Blackness in two countries? The second question is, you referred to several times in your talk about race that discrimination occurs in terms of because of skin color. And by my understanding that it's a more interpretive question that says the meaning attached to skin color, not skin color.
Right, of course.
Because outside of the context of our skin color is skin color meaning.
Right.
For Tulia, it seems to me both implicitly and explicitly part of your analysis that could be generalized and extended comparatively is thinking about the implications of the living for how we think about political politics. And one of my questions then, we think about not just places like Bolivia, the role that Bologna used to play in Italy, places like Curitiba in Brazil that are known for efficient management and leadership of cities and functional cities that are run by progressive governments. And always think about something like Chiapas, right? In a moment now when the world seems to have taken, in most parts of the world, sort of a rightward shift, right? How viable do you think, in some sense, we localize institutional capitalism will be? Because in some sense, that's what happened in the factory years, right? Certain unions, for example, the nurses union, various different unions responded at the local level when they were run by labor, right? slow down reforms that Thatcher wanted to improve, or keep them at bay? So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
So I'll take the second question you posed first. I totally agree with you. It's about the meanings that are attached to skin color, right? So that's a really easy one to answer. The first question, however, is a little more complicated. I think the literature suggests that the extent to which people, so if you're talking about, okay, so Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos that immigrate, well, to the extent that they are identified externally, like if they are perceived as black, if they're perceived as black, then they tend to identify, at least empirically, more with being black, right? And so to the extent that the data that I presented was survey data, so the questioner or the interviewer will ask you what race you identify with, and so for these people, they identify with being black, right? So that just suggests that it's a blunt instrument with which the surveyors or the survey researchers were working. But even if there is some noise there, right? And let's be real about this, there is going to be some noise because of this kind of variation. The fact of the matter is that these people still perceive of themselves more or less black, right? So they feel themselves to be relatively, so Zoli was asking them, so Zoli aggregated these policy winners and losers responses, right? And so whether or not they felt like, and these were objective when it comes to the policy winners and losers, right? For whom did you vote? And he tabulated it by, policy winners and losers. Like, what did you support during this particular time, or what candidates did you support? So these questions were asked, not necessarily by race, but they ask you your race at the end of the survey. And so they are disaggregated and analyzed as such. So I'm going to imagine there's definitely some noise there, but there's still enough cohesion there where the analyst can make some, even at the very least, very preliminary answers, right? Although if they went deeper and they asked them more open-ended questions about what does your race mean, or how many great, what are you, did you have roots in another country? You can ask all those kind of questions, but as far as I'm concerned, he just used those nominal questions, right, to answer. But in reality, the answer would be much more complicated. There's no question about that.
Yes, I think that local politics could be, a laboratory for different political experiments. Ed Gibson, my former advisor, used to say, subnational politics is not national politics in short pants, right? I mean, it's not like it's little politics. It really presents us with another layer of politics, and federal systems in particular have the real possibility of this juncture between what is happening at the national level and what is happening at the state and at the local level. Just to put two examples, in Mexico, the process of democratization that at the federal level took place in 2000, it started at the local level in the 1980s. So cities had become democratic before states became democratic, before the national government became democratic, and largely the trend towards national democratization was the result of that lower level subnational politics democratization that started first in the cities in the 80s, in the states in the 90s, and finally reached the national level. In Brazil also, there were local governments that became sanctuaries for progressist policymakers during the dictatorship. The universal healthcare system that transpired in Brazil in 1988 with the transition to democracy, in fact, has its roots in the 1970s in the Northeast, when a group of very progressive sanitarista, public primary care doctors adopted this policy in the Northeast. So there are ways in which the national and the subnational
can be very different from the point of view of regime type. And you know, in the case of the U.S., we are seeing already that the states are starting to be frontiers or places where the dictums of the national government get some pushback or, you know, cannot be fully implemented. So in that regard, federalism could be a safeguard for, in this case, democracy.
Thank you. Well done. I do have some questions.